The real estate industry is the world's single largest contributor to climate change. At Fifth Wall, we're on a mission to help the industry eradicate its carbon emissions and build to zero.
Well, Chris and Sam, thank you so much for joining. Where are you both coming in from today?
Right now, I'm actually in Los Angeles, popped down here to switch it up a bit, but normally I'm based in San Francisco.
And I'm in San Francisco, a few miles away from our office, which is currently empty as we're all working remotely, but in San Francisco.
Nice. Well, on this video series, Building to Zero, obviously we try to talk to leaders in kind of at the convergence of real estate and technology and sustainability. And both of you are obviously building something that is so squarely at that intersection. So why don't we start maybe with just the founding story of Aurora Solar and like how it came together?
Sure. Yeah, let me kick that off and sort of rewind back to 2011. 2011 is actually when Sam and I met in grad school. We both went to Stanford Business School, and we met quite early in the program and quickly figured out that both of us were entrepreneurially minded. We're trying to figure out what to do post business school. We had different ideas. I actually had some background in off-grid electrification and specifically off-grid solar, and so that was sort of my background that I came into the program with. And as Sam and I were talking about different ideas, one that stuck really early was the idea of starting a solar installation business. And at the time, we're focused on emerging markets where we thought, there's typically a lot of sun, but yet energy is an issue, both in terms of reliability and in terms of cost. And so as we started talking about that idea more, we basically decided to start a business in this space and to put together a pilot project. And so we put together a 50 kilowatt system for a school in Nairobi, Kenya. 50 kilowatts is about 220 solar panels. So it's a sizable system with a big battery bank as well, because there were power cuts every other day. And we wanted to provide continuous service. And so we put that together during business school. We designed the system, we sourced suppliers, we found the project, we hired a local team, we raised a loan actually to finance the system. And then we flew down there as sort of our summer internship, if you will. Spent time on the ground installing the system, overseeing that. And to make a long story short, that was a great success. It's sort of the typical solar success story. The school now saved on their bill every month compared to what they're paying before. They had normal power cuts, and they have now the nice, flashy solar system on the roof. And so what started happening was that other people heard about the success story, and they reached out to us asking, hey, does solar make sense for my home, for my building, for my business? And we realized, well, we don't know. That's sort of, it's actually really difficult to figure this out because solar installations are very just inherently complex. There's a lot of factors that go into it. Every building is different, right? The energy consumption is different, the roof structure is different. You might have skylights, vents, AC units on top of the building. So where do you fit the panels? What are fire code setbacks? And which components do you pick? How much energy do they produce? How do you finance the system? Because all this you need to make sense of during the design process. And so we quickly realized that the process we had to figure that out was just not scalable. It was basically this ever-growing Frankenstein-y Excel spreadsheet. And so we realized, you know what, if we want to scale this as a business and not do another maybe 5 or 10 we could do of these projects, but if we want to do dozens or hundreds of these, we need a scalable process. And that was really the insight that led to what Aurora is today, which is a software platform that helps solar professionals, design systems at scale. It was also clear to us the way that where the future is headed. Solar is forecast, renewables, wind and solar are forecast to go to 50 by 50. So 50% of world energy generation is going to be wind and solar. And it was clear to us there's no way of getting from where we were then and where we are today to that future without a scalable process and a software platform that powers that, that transition, or you might even say revolution. And so that's what we do today. Now we're a pure play software company, SaaS company that works with solar installers all over the world, although our footprint is mainly in North America, in the US right now, and just helps them put more solar on roofs.
Wow, I mean, and I think you both know, I also had a founding story of a business out of Stanford Business School, which was nearly identical to yours. Started over the summer between my first and my second year with my co-founder Adeyemo. And so I know what that's like. I think what's probably different about your experience is, when I was at least at Stanford, alternative energy, and whether you want to call it green tech or clean tech or climate tech, was certainly not in vogue. It was not a place that people were interested in starting businesses. Just what was the passion behind alternative energy? Like, where did that come from for both of you?
Yeah, that's a good point. It's certainly a lot more popular now than it was about 10 years ago at this point. But I think we're still in the early stages of, how ubiquitous this is going to be pretty soon. From my perspective, a lot of the passion had to do with, as an operator or someone who's really going to commit your life's work to something, you get maybe 1 or 2 shots at doing something big, something that's really meaningful, something that you feel very confident that over the next 10, 20, 30 years is going to be much more significant than it is today. And what that forces you to do is really think critically about things that aren't just like fads, things that are here to stay for a long term. And from my perspective, renewable energy and specifically solar was something that met all of that criteria. Chris alluded to this phrase 50 by 50, which is something that comes from Bloomberg New Energy Finance. And again, that's 50% of the world's energy mix will come from wind and solar by 2050. So then you take that back and you say, well, where are we today? And in solar, less than 2% of our energy mix comes currently from solar. And this is of the energy market, which is a humongous market. So there's a huge amount of runway to go there. And that's something that you feel confident that you can bank on, for the next 10, 20, 30 years. And that was something that I was interested in. In addition to just looking at the opportunity set from a personal standpoint, it was just very clear to me that the path we were on, destroying our environment in one way, shape, or another, was not sustainable. I come from a finance background where we weren't really destroying the environment from a physical standpoint, but you saw what happened when there were excesses in systems and markets and things collapsed. And it's one thing in financial markets where you can recover, but if you do that to your actual physical environment, there really isn't any coming back from that. So working in a space that from a long-term perspective was clearly going to grow and expand and just be increasingly significant, and at the same time having the real privilege of it being something that really positively impacts society, was the combination of everything I was looking for to commit my life's work to. So yeah, 10 years later, still feel the same way. Can't believe it's been that long. But it does feel like now we're really hitting this acceleration point of this went from being, that's had a rough stretch, to increasingly getting its footing, and I think soon becoming like an inevitability, which is what we're actually hopefully helping to accelerate and just make ubiquitous, as I mentioned.
And that's a great point. This notion of like alternative energy for the real estate industry, which we all know is one of the most consumptive industries with respect to energy, both on a construction basis and an ongoing basis. There's an inevitability to it. Like, it doesn't matter whether you want it to happen, care about it happening, whether you have a negative association with green tech or clean tech or climate tech or any one of these phrases. This is coming, as you said, Sam, by 50, the phrase 50 by 50, right? Like that's a 25x increase. And so, we talk to real estate owners all the time, and they are to some extent aware of this. But how would you, if you were talking to a real estate owner, almost instructively guide them to the conclusion that solar is probably a significant part of the future of their business. It's not just an exercise today to do for regulators necessarily, though it can be. It is the future of your business. How do you make that point when you speak to a real estate owner?
Yeah, I would say that, when you speak to a real estate owner, I think in an abstract sense, you're not going to get a lot of pushback that, yes, this is the future, right? Like, I think most people, when you look at things that are associated with clean tech, whether it's things like electric vehicles or items on that sense, everyone has a sense of like, yes, that is where we're going eventually. I think the key part is to make them understand that if you're not taking action now, it's actually costing you money. Like every day that you're not doing something, that's savings that you could be generating. That's good publicity that you could be generating. That's asset appreciation that you could be having. So I would say that that's the major difference. That's more the conversation. Imparting some of that urgency. Leave aside all the good things that you're doing for society, which is why you see organizations like Google and Apple and Microsoft and Facebook, name them, talk about greenifying their data centers. So it's really about having them realize that from their perspective, there is this asset that they're failing to monetize, their real estate, number one. And then number two, there's a lot of goodwill that they're failing to capitalize on because people care about this. People care about their environment. It's increasingly becoming front and center of people's minds every time you have some sort of natural disaster or things along those lines. So the conversations that I find us having these days isn't so much whether it's going to happen. It's just more about creating that sense of urgency that, if you're not investigating this, if you're not talking to your local solar installer, or at least just doing some preliminary number crunching of what does this mean for me, you're literally, as every day passes, falling further behind and giving up opportunity. And that's really the key, getting that sense of urgency.
And so what's interesting in the way you phrase it, there has been, I think, this like disjunction between the altruism, right, of doing what's right for the world and what is in future generations' sustainable interest, right, which is clear and not to be understated, but also what's in your short-term commercial interest, right, your financial imperative. And I agree. I do think those two things have somehow been artificially divorced. How do you make that case? Because I imagine a lot of real estate owners are like, well, it's so complex, right? I don't know the sunlight in this particular area. I don't understand the geometry of my roof and the relation. Like, how do you simplify that in a way that they can understand that? Because I know that's a large part of what Aurora does, right? It helps render something very complicated for someone that is in the business of selling space, the real estate industry, and lets them tap into all of this physics innovation that have allowed you to power your building with the power of the sun. How do you translate that?
Yeah, it's a important question. Like you said, that's very central to what we do. The sort of short answer is like, we've got you covered. That's how we and 100 of us spend every day and many hours within the day. So it's a complex problem. Like you said, every roof is different, and the shape profile differs. There's neighboring structures, there's trees, there's all there's maybe a mountain range nearby that now includes maybe the evening hours to some degree. And there's all these constraints around electrical components, where you place them, what's the most efficient system, how does one design choice impact energy production, what does that mean for the savings of the building, energy savings, bill savings of the building, and how do you finance these systems, right? There's a lot of questions, but that's where that's where sort of the product we built really adds value. We help answer exactly that question. It's a simple question. Does solar make sense for me, right? For my home, for my business? And our software covers that. At the end of it, you get a layout, you get a good and ideal optimal system, you get savings calculations, energy production calculations, the environmental impact calculations, and the financials as well. Now, the way to go about it is contact a local solar company. They can help you figure that out. They would use a product like ours, hopefully ours, but in any case, software to figure out what makes sense for your building, and whether you're a fit. There's no downside in that. Reaching out and saying, hey, I have this asset, like Sam said, right? I'm sitting on this asset. What might I do with it, right? Actually, there's a tremendous amount of rooftop potential in the US. I've seen some estimates that said around close to 40% of US energy consumption could be covered from solar PV rooftop potential, which is
that's a fascinating stat, right? Because that's an asset that real estate owners probably, to date have not really conceptualized as being a source of monetization or a source of cost savings. And I guess when you think about that question of, you asked, where real estate owners are questioning, does solar make sense for me, for my building, where I am, given all of its characteristics? Does it make sense for me? Is the answer, when it's all said and done, right, when all the complexity is kind of squeezed out of that question, is the answer yes more often than no? Meaning, like, and is that trending up? Meaning, are we enfranchising more of that roof space economically just on account of technological progress? And I guess a related question is, how much could and should financing markets, right, if you had more efficient, bigger financing markets to finance these installations and bear risk differently, like most capital markets, how evolved is that? And to the extent that changed, how much would that shift the answer to like 100% yes, right, for all of that roof space?
Two questions in there. Let me take the first one. I'll let Am take the second part. It's increasingly yes. In many cases, yes. And sort of that's also the beauty of sort of this process that's in motion. I remember the very first project that I did back in 2008. And that was a very small scale project, but nevertheless, we bought solar panels at $3 a watt. So that's for a solar panel, say $600, $750 in that range. Next year we came back and it was $2 a watt. So it went down to say $400 or $500. Now it's down to 30 cents a watt in many places, right? So it's an order of magnitude, a tenfold decrease in the cost of solar. Every time you decrease the cost of solar, it becomes attractive somewhere else, right? There's always a balance of factors. It's like, what's the roof area? What's the, how much sun you get? What's the shade profile? What's the energy costs of that building? So there's a lot of factors that you need to make that balance out and you need to make sense of. But increasingly, the answer is yes. And so that's the beauty of it.
When you say the increasingly the answer is yes, meaning more and more roof space that would otherwise not be viable is now enfranchised as being an unequivocal yes to the question of, does solar make sense for me?
Exactly.
And how fast is that changing? Like, if you were to look at, how many real estate owners would be able to answer yes to that question 10 years ago versus today? Just give me a sense of, almost impressionistically, like, how much has that grown?
10 years ago, unless, there were altruistic motivations, I think largely the answer would have been no.
Right.
Today, we're in a place where many times, the majority of cases, probably the answer is yes. Certainly depends on the geography, right? But here in California, I think the answer would be yes more often than not. And so that's the beauty of it, and that's where the solar story is unfolding, and that's what's driving this transition. We're not going to get to 50% renewables by just people doing this from the good of their hearts. Although there's that argument to be made there too. But you don't have to make that trade-off. It's about economics. It actually makes sense. In many places, solar is the cheapest source of energy.
And so this kind of the one part of the question, obviously, being the kind of inexorable progress technologically that just enables owners to do this more efficiently. The answer is just, there are massive tailwinds behind that. And Sam, it sounds like you have a view also on capital markets, meaning, I guess, what is the state today of the financing available for a real estate owner who wants to finance these projects? And what do you think it looks like 10 years in the future? And how much does that change, again, the amount of space where you can answer yes to the question of, does solar make sense for me?
Yeah, that's a great question. You know, what financing has done is helped change some of those yes to emphatic yes.
Okay.
Has helped make some of those marginal yeses into duh, no brainer, like absolutely.
Like you should be fired from your job if you don't do this,
Yeah,
basically.
exactly. Like what? Like this could be the highest ROI investment you make all year.
Right.
As long as the sun rises in the east and sets in the west, you're going to be doing well. So, but just to answer it more specifically, you know, you could think of real estate owners in two broad categories, right? Like if you're a homeowner, you're a real estate owner. So
Yeah.
for your own house, does solar make sense? And then, you know, probably some more of the commercial real estate owners as well. People who own malls or office buildings, et cetera, et cetera. And the reason it's important to distinguish those two markets is the market for financing residential solar installations is much more mature than it is for the commercial property owners. In the residential space, that has been one of the biggest catalysts. You had equipment costs come down, but the access of standardized financing for most homeowners has really opened up the market. We're now at the point where probably about 3/4 of residential solar installations are financed. And that was a fraction of that 10 years ago. And it's as standardized as you go out there, you want solar for your house. There's several different providers you can pick. You pick a particular term and a rate, and you know it's as simple, maybe even easier than getting a mortgage to a certain extent. There's still a lot of room for those costs to come down because fees are very high in that space. So there are lots of opportunities in that space, but nevertheless, at least it's largely accessible. In the commercial space, that is a quite different story. There are a lot of you know, unique factors, idiosyncratic factors with access to financing. And I think that the biggest change between now and 10 years from now is that that will look a lot more standardized and a lot closer to the residential space than it does today, where each one requires much more back and forth to understand what are the unique characteristics, what's the ownership structure, do you have subtenants, you know, all of these, you know, special rules that make it a little bit harder to standardize.
Right.
However, I do think that the point is that when you are able to get access to financing, and any competent solar installation company can, you know, at least broker that for you. When you are able to get access to that financing, what does the ROI look like? And I mean, it is in many situations with no money down, you're generating net savings for your business. And the degree to which that affects you is partly dependent on what's your profitability, what are your depreciation tax shields, all of these various factors. But at the end of the day, it's a yes today, and with standardized financing, which makes it even more affordable, it'll just be an emphatic yes.
Yeah, and you know, it feels like this, you know, 50 by 50, right? If that is going to occur, I mean, the amount of spend on this category is dramatic. So even for the least altruistically minded capital sources out there, getting in front of that and financing that, because you have different risk profiles to, you know, any asset that has a different payback period, is just so intuitive. And it's interesting to hear what you said about there's this distinction between residential markets, which, you know, is largely the consumer thinking about a cost, from a cost perspective. They're usually not generating lots of income out of their house, versus a commercial building where there actually is top line profit. And so you have multiple ways to change demand, because tenants obviously are demanding this of their landlords at an altruistic level, or, you know, compliant with whatever their mandate is around, you know, net neutrality. And I guess as you think about that, how much does regulation play a role in that? Obviously, California, you know, came out and was requiring solar panels, but what do you think the future of the regulatory landscape around solar looks like over the next 10 years? And maybe to answer the question, maybe bifurcate that a bit between residential and commercial as well.
Yeah, I'll share my initial thoughts. I think that when it comes to regulation, it's almost easier to describe what it would look like over the next 20 or 30 years, because longer term, it's clear, at least to me, that we're headed in the direction of increasingly supportive regulation for this industry because of all of the positive today, well, initially externalities, right? Like things having to do with the environment, et cetera, but increasingly just as a pure economic driver and an economic engine. Even through the last downturn we had after the financial crisis, et cetera, solar has been shown to be one of the fastest job creation categories in the US, and actually now employs way more people than like coal and many other industries as well. So I think that there's going to be a big push to support that. And it's hard to tell depending on which administration comes or goes, but it's a little bit easier to say that over the long term, there'll be increasingly supportive policies for this industry, and both at the federal level and at the local state level, which is what we're seeing a lot of today. I'll actually let Chris continue with this conversation because you can wax eloquent on this for the rest of this session, but I think Chris probably has some opinions.
And I should note the date we're recording this is October 27th, 2020.
Well, that's why I said let's focus on the longer term, just so that anything I say doesn't become very true or less true in a week or two.
Look, Brendan, it's obviously there's a place for regulation in solar, but it's also important to actually start with the fact that this just makes sense and makes increasing sense as that cost curve comes down. So it's not something that's dependent anymore in many places on regulation, right? In the early days, that was different, where you wanted to incentivize tax credits and so forth, and that I think was a incredibly worthwhile investment on behalf of the federal government and many local authorities as well to subsidize what's become is becoming the future of energy, right? And so I just want to put that up front. Having said that, now there's a place for regulation, and what you'll see is, irrespective of what happens next week and generally at the federal level, so you see a lot of local areas, step up, right? California, like you said, stepped up with the mandate and said, it is our goal. We are affected directly by climate change too, with the wildfires and so forth, right? It's our goal and the droughts, and it's our goal to do what we can to transition to a net neutral carbon, a future where we rely more and more on renewables. So there's those areas where local governments can step up. There's a room in the permitting process where the regulators can step up and help streamline that, right? There's a lot of room for regulation, but the future of solar doesn't solely depend on it.
Right. And I guess what advice would you give to, say, a commercial real estate owner that truly does, for, say, both altruistic and truly commercial reasons, care about decarbonizing more broadly, so kind of beyond, obviously, solar, but inclusive of it as well? What advice would you give them about what to do? And the reason I'm asking the question is obviously that this is something we're spending a lot of time on, which is it feels like the commercial real estate industry has sat out the last 2 decades of technological innovation in real estate tech, which is obviously what we do, but secondarily in climate tech. And what advice would you give them to say, like, you need to be more involved in this because it's so imperative to the future of your business? How would you convey that to them?
Yeah, it goes back to, there's a couple elements to that, right? One is literally consider the asset you're sitting on, and not just in maybe the traditional sense you look at it, which is, I have real estate, I rent it out or whatever I might do, right? But there's other ways actually of creating value with that asset. So that's one way in which solar, for example, can add value to you. The other thing is things develop quickly, right? So I would also encourage people to just stay in tune with what's happening, right? And I know Fifth Wall can help with that too. And there's other sources of information where you can just stay abreast of what's happening, because what may not be an opportunity today might next year or 2 years from now, right? And solar obviously is one of those where just the developments happen so quickly, but there's so much more. EV charging infrastructure, right? For example, there's a lot you can probably do there if you own commercial real estate. Solar doesn't just go on roofs. There's carports too, for example, right? Double benefit. You have a carport, you provide shade, yet you obviously generate electricity and savings, right? And the interplay of those also going to be very interesting. Energy efficiency is another area. Like there's so much, and it keeps evolving. And we went through a bit of a sort of a boom and somewhat of a bust in the clean tech cycle, which is why that sort of got a bit of a bad rap about 10 years ago or so. But increasingly we're coming out of that, and there's a lot of real innovation and real sustained trends that are happening, and those are not going to go away. And so just staying in tune and evaluating those opportunities, I think, is a very worthwhile thing to do, even if it's not something you're going to do today. I would certainly encourage you to look at it, but that might change in 12 or 24 months from now.
And I guess, related question is from the other side. So now not from the real estate owner's perspective, but for just someone that's passionate about this issue. I think it's counterintuitive to a lot of people that the real estate industry is so contributive to the climate crisis, right? That, it's responsible for 30% of CO2 emissions. And it's an industry that, really has never shared the spotlight with other industries like, manufacturing and transportation that, I think people typically think of a priori as like the industry culprits in climate change. What would you encourage, like just anyone who's a consumer and passionate about this issue to ask of the real estate industry to hold it accountable, right? For its role, like, meaning this is not just real estate owners are responsible. We want the world to be asking questions of who builds their homes, who manages their office buildings, how their products are getting to their house, real estate questions. Like, what are those questions they should be asking?
Yeah, there are a number of questions you can be asking, but one of the simplest things that you can do as, say, a tenant or anyone else who's holding the real estate owner accountable is ask, can we have a choice as to where we're sourcing our energy from? From a consumer standpoint, it's very easy to switch depending on what territory you're in. But if you take a place like California, you can choose a green option, which means that the energy is sourced from sustainable sources, renewable energy, et cetera, et cetera. One of the things I'm proud of is we don't own real estate, but we were certified as a San Francisco green business before the office was shut down. But being certified as a green business entailed things like choosing what our source of energy would be, installing a few energy efficiency measures. And these little things end up making a big difference. And even by asking the question, you may be prompting the landlord to think of things that they hadn't thought of before.
Right.
And given that the economics are so compelling, just bringing this front and center to someone's mind so that they say, well, let me actually just look into this, they'll likely be pleasantly surprised by what they have. So anything that just causes a real estate owner to start thinking about this and taking the first steps of, let me go in and run a Google search or, just pick up the phone and call, a professional in this space. Anyone that causes that action to occur so that you fight inertia, you're doing your part in some way, shape, or form to, helping improve the situation. So that's just one tangible thing.
Yeah, I think that's totally right. And I think part of it is people don't typically think of the real estate industry as being a supplier to other industries, but it is. You are supplying space and you are powering and electrifying that space. And how you do that makes a big difference. So for many of the companies that are making very bold, very ambitious, very important pledges to become carbon neutral, they're typically referring to their suppliers, and they're including their suppliers as well within that chain. And you think about like Amazon, Like one of Amazon's biggest suppliers is the real estate industry with warehouses and data centers and now retail stores. So I totally agree with that comment. It's just almost reframing the real estate industry as one of every industry's biggest suppliers, because you need to supply space, and how you power that space actually makes a big difference in the actual carbon neutrality and carbon impact of any operating business. Well, Sam and Chris, as always, it's awesome to get your perspectives on this. Like, if people want to learn more about Aurora Solar, I think just visit the website, and I'm sure there's lots of information to kind of help real estate owners navigate this important transition they need to make.
Yeah, absolutely. Website www.aurorasolar.com. We also have a blog. We blog about topics in the industry and concepts and sort of educational topics. Otherwise, also, I encourage you to reach out to your local solar company. Many of them are our clients, and they'll be using our product to help you answer that question. Hey, does solar make sense for me? And I think you'd be surprised what the answer is and how good that answer can look. So encourage you to do that. And in any case, just like I said, stay abreast, because things are changing, and importantly, also things need to change, and we all have roles to play as individuals and as businesses. And I think it's just important to be cognizant of that, and together, that's what gets us excited. There's really an opportunity to build a future that is better than the present that we live in. And so that's our hope. That's what gets us out of bed every day, as well as not just the two of us. Importantly, there's more than 100 of us now. It's a big problem that requires a lot of talented folks to come together on a daily basis. And so that's what gets us excited.
Well, thank you both for joining. And obviously tune in again if you want to hear more, I think, really interesting perspectives on sustainability, as we'll be interviewing more folks like Chris and Sam on Building to Zero. So thanks, guys.